a chapter about boreal forests as complex adaptive system. Because for those of you who comes from the Brazil or the tropics or even the southern United States, you look at the boreal forest and you say, it's not complex. There's one or three species. They're all the same. So why are we talking about a complex system, and why should we try to maintain the adaptability of this forest? So we asked him to write something about this, and I think his main conclusion was that it's a very simple forest, but that is extremely complex. And I really like that. It's a very simple, but very complex. Do you accept that? Because complex and simple are not, in the terminology that I use, is not the same as simple and very, very varied or very diverse. It's simple but very complex. And he says it was interesting to explore spatial hierarchies, external subsidies, sort of, as one of the dimensions by which boreal forests are more complex than they seem. This is partially expressed in disturbances generating shifting landscape mosaic, etc., etc. And Steve has shown a very, very simple system, but that is actually very complex. Eve also, so that's, and I will go very quickly, but simple structure and dynamics, but from a burn, here are some graphics, and you see that in papers, you can have a burn, but depending on the initial conditions of the advanced regeneration, you can have all kinds of different conditions. And these are only often a forest with 2-3 species. And this is a very good example of the balsam fir with the spruce budworm. And someone wrote a paper about all of the other herbivores and parasitoids, etc., that are interacting with the balsam fir and with the spruce budworm in a forest that has one species or two. This is the boreal forest. You know, it's not the tropics where we like to think it has all the. I mean, this is very simple, and I know many of you will be working with bacteria and fungus, and there's millions of them interaction. It's actually a lot of interaction. And what is interesting at the boreal forest is you have spatial, temporal, and hierarchical factors. The fire regime that's changed, that burns at different landscapes. So there are other processes that you may not find in a forest like the tropics or even in the deciduous forest that are acting in the boreal, making the system very dynamic and very complex. And even the Populus tumuloides, this is the distribution of the species, which is a very simple species in many ways, but it's quite interesting. It actually grows a lot by the roots, so it's a clone. But when we go in the stand, you will find sometimes 20, 30, 40 different kind of clones that react differently. If you do a clay cut, it's not the same clone that will dominate than if you have a fire. So you even have lots of variation from one side to the other depending on the type of disturbance. You will not have the same clone, so there's a lot of this genetic variability within a species that grow as this kind of clone. So it's quite interesting. And then the fire regime that varies from region, so we've seen that. So a forest fairly simple can have, because of all of these factors interacting at different scales, can be actually behaving as a very complex system. Okay, Robin Chasden, tropics. We asked her, okay, write a chapter about the tropical forest as complex adaptive system. She's very well known, written lots of papers about the tropical forest. You see, this is a picture that I took in Panama, and I'm not sure, but probably in this picture you probably have around 10, 15 different species, whereas here we'll have 1 or 2 or 3, but anyway, very, very varied. So, very diversified, complex, and resilient. This was actually maybe the most controversial argument that she made the point that, contrary to what we think, the tropical forest is very diversified, is very complex, but it's very resilient. And she said, what I gained from writing my chapter is an understanding of how management can be applied to restore the regenerative capacity in tropical forests by enhancing the forest's intrinsic capacity of self-organization, self-regulation following disturbance. there's no one size fit all, so it means there's no recipe. And what works in the Southern America will not work in Asia or Borneo, etc. We're very happy, right? She endorsed the complex adaptive system. It was wonderful. So she put this table that is quite interesting. She compared what was a kind of the belief that we have about the tropical forest and what she sees is more the truth when we look at it as a complex adaptive system. A lot of beliefs that the forest specialists are vulnerable to land use change, and she says no, biodiversity can be sustained within a landscape matrix of different land use and land covers, so even with the management of human. Short-term assessment of losses, usually based on static data immediately following disturbance. She says that this comes from analyzing something in the short term. When you look at the long term, you can see that although the stand and the dynamic can change, but the forest recovers and maintains its main process and probably even the main services. Value of forests are based on comparison with value of pristine forests. So she kind of says we've always looked at a managed forest and look at the pristine forest to evaluate, are we doing okay? And she sees that we should look at value of forest based on non-forest and looking at variable forest states as not necessarily negative things, and probably also looking at the ecosystem services. And then we should focus on individual species and population. Here still we should focus on ecosystem properties and services. Fairly optimistic view. I'm sure not everybody will agree with this, but it was basically trying to show that even if you have a very, very diverse forest in terms of species, it can still be very resilient to all of these. Okay. And this guy, oh, well, that was a guy I wanted to throw out after a while. He was tough. He was really tough. But now it's probably the guy that I've learned the most. Because what he said, after 2 days, you remember, he said, you guys, you're wasting your time. Because what affects the tropics is nothing to do with the ecology or what the forester can do. It's political, it's corruption, it's poverty, and these are the very important elements. And then we said, well, why don't you write a chapter about this? So he did. So he brought the social, political, environmental complex into the complex adaptive system. Because in many places, and it's true here, it's not only the biology that affects the forest, it's many things. And what did he say? Anyone endeavoring to improve forest management practices quickly realize that if an intervention is going to be successful, it needs to reflect the full complexity of issues, which means not only in the forest, but the geographical, intellectual, and concept and terminology made clear by complex adaptive system theorists. Surprises, non-linearity, threshold, legacy will all work on this. Resilience, hierarchy, emergent properties, they have to be considered. He bought our complex adaptive system and he's very happy, and Elise has been working with him writing a paper, and he's probably the one providing the best example and feedback. So he developed this thing about how just one variable, the hollow tree, that when they go in the forest, they don't know if the tree is hollow or not, and if it's hollow, they cut it and leave it down, and they have to cut a lot of trees before they find a tree that is not hollow. And the hollow trees will link with worker safeties, with profit, that will have timber recovery, will have impact with sanction from government, will have impact in terms of biodiversity, fire risk intensity, carbon emission. I mean, basically looking at all of these interactions between the stakeholders and a lot of the other variables, and basically saying that if you want to manage a forest, to sustain it in terms of ecosystem services, you have to bring a lot of these others consideration, political, social. And in the countries like the tropics, often it means corruption, poverty, the fact that you have the best regulation, but people go and and do a lot of things that are illegal, etc. So an interesting chapters, which forced us to add this component to the complex adaptive system. Okay. I'm already talking too much. You know this guy, Alain Paquette, we asked him to talk about tree plantation as complex adaptive system. And he says, in a few words, that he's still, it's funny because in this he said, I'm still struggling with the difference between diversity and complexity. Because it seems that to maintain a complex adaptive system, you have to have a diverse system. But I was happy that I was in La Tuque with him last week and I gave a talk and he told me, now I think I understand the difference between diversity and complexity. So I will test that with you. But basically, these are monocultures, these are polycultures, and there's a lot of work being done everywhere in the world to try to see what are the relationship between, what are the functioning of an ecosystem that has many species in comparison to monocultures in terms of niche partitioning, facilitation, functional redundancy. There's a lot of interesting stuff being done to show that a complex forest or a complex system in terms of diversity of species, of complementarity in terms of the interaction, because you can have a lot of species, but if they are not interacting in a way that support each other, it has no impact. So that's just diversity is not enough. You have to have a diverse system where you have these different processes occurring. And okay, I will go over this, but a bit of a publicity. We have started a series of experiments with diverse trees where they are very close to each other because we want to create interaction very quickly. We plant monocultures, mixtures of species in these little square. And basically, what we are looking at is what is the effect if you increase species richness, and what is the impact if you increase functional diversity in terms of the diversity of traits, just so that everybody understands. You could have 4 species that are 4 different birch species that will have very similar characteristics. So you have 4 species, but they will have a low functional diversity versus 4 species that are maybe a pine, a spruce, a maple, and let's say a birch. Still 4 species, but with much more diversity. So we're looking at what is the effect of this 2 type of diversity on the functioning of the ecosystem. And we even look at coevolution in a way by looking at exotic species that have very similar traits than our native species. But what happens if you bring them into our ecosystem? And this could help us with this assisted migration business we're talking about. I know environmentalists hate that. I look at one person because they say, oh, this is an exotic species and it will destroy nature. Well, we've already destroyed nature. Nature is dead. It doesn't exist. We've killed it.
We are part of it.
We've killed it or we're part of it. Yeah, okay. So if we are part of it, then all the climate change, they're all natural, and then we should not worry about it.
Oh, I'm not saying that.
I know. But anyway, I should not provoke because that will create. So just show you that these are the amount of wood being produced in these different monocultures. We have one plot with 12 species, 2 species, 4 species, 6 species, all kinds of mixtures, only conifers, only deciduous. But here is very simple, just came out recently, but these are species richness. These are the amount of wood being produced from all monocultures that are 1 species. There's a lot of variability, 2 species, 4 species, or 12 species, and the amount increases on average. There's a lot of variability depending where you are, but on average, you can see that there is some kind of complementarity, so that when you have more species, on average, you will produce more wood, which fits exactly what we found in our papers when we look at all of the permanent plots in Quebec. So it's significant.
So, Christian,
Yeah.
could you back up one slide?
Sure. Sometimes I was afraid to show this slide because I thought there would be a lot of questions, but okay.
So let's look at the graph on the top
Yeah.
So the point is, yes, on average, if I have 4 or more species, I get a gain of what, 4,000 over 3,000.
Yeah.
Whatever those units are, I cannot read them.
Yeah.
But
Totally.
what's to stop a manager from saying, well, look, I can get a 6,000 with one species, give me one of those, please.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It's true. This single species, but you see, sometimes you have a bigger amount, but this single species here might produce more. And you're right, but this is only the production of wood. I'm not talking about susceptibility to uncertainty in the future, which means resilience. And these are other things we're looking at, because if you only have one species and you have a drought, it might actually decrease a lot in growth, whereas if you have many species, it won't decrease, so it will reduce its effect. There's actually, Tillman and his group, looking at grasses, they've shown very clearly, there's a recent study that shows that the complementarity effect even increases with time, because the more you go, the more the diversity of species tend to make the potential loss of growth due to extreme climate having less an impact. This is only after 3 years growth. And we believe that in the long run, it will increase, the differences will increase. But you're right. And I'm not saying that if you manage intensively one species somewhere and you remove all the constraints, you may probably have a greater gain, but you may have to intervene more often to stop disease, maybe even go fertilize, or, it has an impact in the long term. Yeah?
A good way to look at complementarity effects and such, or sampling effects, is look at the over-yielding and transgressive over-yielding. So you want to see if the species in monoculture are in mixtures, are doing better relative to their monoculture growth. So that would be a better way to...
But you often have a monoculture which we call the sampling effect that is very, very productive.
Yeah, and that's why you have to divide those effects.
Okay, maybe I will go through very quickly. That was Tasmania. Nobody cares about Tasmania, because I want to let some time to my friends. Here I have a title of the uneducation of the foresters. I think that the trend in the last 50 years was to uneducate us. I use that term because when I was in forestry, in French we say, on éduque le peuplement. It means that we were trained to educate the stand. That was a French term. So now I thought we should say we need to uneducate. This was the view of forestry from the past. Single equilibrium, reduced variability. We don't want disturbance. We fight insect. We fight. The people use the forest, and we maximize sustained yield of wood. And if we do this, because remember we thought that we could simplify the stand and we will maintain all of the other processes, we say everything is fine. So there was this ecosystem management that you've heard a lot about it. Historical variability is very important, so we look at the past to see what was the historical variability. We accept disturbance. We realize that disturbance is important. We realize that we are part of this ecosystem, so we can use it, but we have a duty in terms of biodiversity, and we manage for multiple use. But wood is often always the main focus. And then some ideas about managing for complexity. We want variability. Variability is good, because the more variability you have in terms of stand structure and diversity, the more chance that the forest will be able to respond to disturbance and recreate some conditions that are favorable for a lot of the services. Here I say foster creative disturbance. Creative, maybe you don't like it, but we should go in the forest and make disturbances that take into consideration what are the likely future conditions, so that we will make the forest more resilient to the future conditions. So we should create disturbances or even introduce some species that will increase the resiliency of the forest to future possible conditions. So that's what we mean by the creative disturbance. We are responsible for future options. It's a lot about sustainable forest management. And we want to maximize, but the flexibility of future options. I think For me, more and more, what we want is not maximizing the yield of the wood, but maximizing all the future options in terms of all the services, quality of water, carbon. And that's why if we start calculating all these services, we might change totally the way we will manage the forest, because we'll realize that who knows if in 50 years the value of a ton of carbon might not be $300, which would be way above any other values, and that would be the main purpose of managing the forest. Maybe water quality would be so important that any management should be made in terms of maximizing water production. So we don't know. And I would provide an example. We have an example in the book, but when I was in BC, I did my doctorate in BC, foresters, and I think in Oregon they did the same, they were going and fighting the forest. They were killing all the alder. Alder was a weed. We didn't want the alder. So they sprayed it, cut it, but the alder, do you know what it does? It fixes nitrogen for free. It has an incredibly beautiful red wood, and now I don't know what is the value, but a few years ago the value of this alder was almost as high as Douglas fir. And now suddenly, oh, we want alder. We spent 30 years fighting it, putting a lot of money, and now we like it. Because people didn't manage with uncertainty in the future, they assume. I've heard one day of foresters in Ontario tell me, there was a mixed forest, balsam fir, yellow birch, and they were planting black spruce there. I said, why are you planting black spruce? Well, the mill there uses black spruce. And I said, how long does it take to grow? 80 years. And what were they making with the black spruce? Newspaper. Well, 20 years later, the newspaper is almost gone. So, anyway, we'll talk a lot about this, but there's a problem in the way we do forestry. And it's still part of the law. We plant trees that the forest companies need today. I believe we should plant to make the forest resilient, the forest diverse, and if there are woods in the future that provide all of these services, people will use the wood for something. Steve is...
Just further to your remark, about 10, 11 years ago, I was doing some modeling for a forestry company in BC, and their big plan to improve productivity was to plant lodgepole pine on high elevation sites. You get that lodgepole pine, mountain pine beetle. I think this would never ever work. So examples such as
there is example everywhere.
Yeah.
Of course, one good example in Europe is that I think the German and the French planted trees, oak and others to build their boat, to continue fighting each other. And when the trees came into effect, well, they were not building boats, so now they're making nice cabinets and other things, still fighting with each other, but with other purposes. But anyway. So let's move on. I go quickly because I just want to say the future challenge. What do? We do silvicultural practices that encourage heterogeneity and the ability to self-organize and adapt. I think that's our objective. That's what we should do. We should have silvicultural practices that will create more heterogeneity, because out of this heterogeneity, we hope that the forest will be able to self-adapt and self-organize. We'll talk more about it. This is, no, okay, I won't talk about it. I just want to finish with some, yeah, this is interesting, it's from the book. We look at different systems in the world, close to nature in Germany, systemic silviculture in Italy, ecosystem management, you heard about it, mixed plantation, variable retention, reduced impact logging, they do that in the tropics. Continuous cover forestry, it's another term where you do partial cutting. The new forestry that Franklin in the West, integrated forest management, uneven age, because a lot of silviculturists think that uneven age is like complexity, and that when they do uneven age management, they do complex adaptive system. Anyway, we heard a lot about it. So we look at the characteristics or the properties of a complex system: openness, heterogeneity, diversity, hierarchy, memory, self-organization, uncertainty, and adaptation. And we look at, okay, which system or which properties is not maybe being implemented very nicely, and I think the uncertainty is missing in almost all of these elements. Most of them don't really consider that the future is uncertain. They think that it's fairly certain. And most of these practices, they put that in place saying we know about the future. Another problem was openness. Many of them, they have a bit about openness, but don't recognize it very clearly. And I think close to nature is a big problem. They manage at the stand level, and they don't really consider. And adaptation also is something that is not so strong in many of a lot of those systems. I think what a lot of these things have focused on was bringing more heterogeneity and diversity in structure and composition. Okay, pretty good. And recognizing that there is a biological legacies. I mean, a lot of these practices have actually been good at this, but not at the other elements of a complex adaptive system that we feel very important. Okay, I have too many things. I won't talk about it. I'm sorry, no time. I really want Klaus to make his bad jokes. So I'm almost done. So a few things about how do we do this. We need to plan at the landscape level, not the stand scale. And foresters have always planned everything at the stand scale. Now we're starting to move at the landscape scale, and probably the new tools are helping us. We should look at how nature works to develop our intervention. See, I'm adapting. I'm reconciling with, yes, let's look at how nature works. Okay. We need to make sure that we maintain the diversity of species with a diversified and complementary ecological characteristic so that they will respond to the current and possible future disturbance. I think we should start looking at what is ahead of us and look at the diversity of species that we have and ask ourselves if all of these crazy future possible disturbances occur, do we have a pool of species that are able to respond and adapt so that we'll still have a forest in the future? For example, if the Asian longhorn arrives and wiped out all of the maple, do we have enough diversity that other species will replace the maple and we'll still have a forest? We won't make sugar maple syrup, sorry Emily, but we'll still have a forest. The chestnut in the States disappeared. There was, I read that there was small villages that had big parties about chestnut. They survived, they did something else. What did they start to do?
They're bringing it back now.
Well, they're trying to, slowly. Okay, another one. What we leave is more important than what we take. Well, this is hard for foresters, but we should think much more about what we leave there as memory, as legacies, and I think we have improved quite a bit about this. And the importance to maintain redundancy in species attributes, because for whatever reason, if a species play a key role, have a very important process, and it's killed by an insect and a disease, you need another species that could replace it and play the same role. So have some redundancy is important. To me, this is maybe the most important things, and what is the most lacking right now is plan for uncertainty and uncertain future. And when I say that, I don't say that there's no hope. We can start developing some kind of an envelope of possible future conditions, and a lot of people work on scenarios planning. You put a group of people together, and that's what we'll do this afternoon. Think about what are the worst scenarios or the best scenarios, economic, ecological, environmental, and see what kind of approaches will be successful in all of these scenarios. It might not be optimal for any of the conditions, but might work. And maybe we are there now. We are trying to manage forests so that we will maintain a useful, functioning forest under a lot of uncertainties. So that's very important. Promote diversity of crops that could favor diversity of species. Of course, doing clear cuts everywhere will not encourage diversity. I think the more different type of cuts you do, the more different type of species you will favor. And a diversity of species also is a good insurance for adaptability. And I think we should start now adapting the forest to future climatic conditions. Maybe by moving some provenances, we can take the same species but moving them around. In BC they do that. There's many places in the world they start doing this. And I said a good maybe start moving species also, which we call assisted migration. I'm not totally certain, but I think we should not evacuate that possibility. Let's say we lose the maple, we lose the beech, we lose the hemlock, we lose all these species here. Maybe we should go and take some species elsewhere that play the same roles and bring it here and accept that we will have a new forest, but that will have a diversity of species that will provide some of the services we want. So I finish here. Forestry and ecology need to be reconciled to develop the silviculture of the future. We believe that this complex adaptive system is a framework. It's an interesting framework because I think it allows this reconciliation of ecology and forestry. When we look at it, we felt that it was maybe a bridge to finally bridge the two groups and develop some, and use actually already a lot of the very good new silvicultural systems that are occurring in the world, and maybe ask them to adjust it a little bit to take more consideration the properties of complex adaptive system. And we should look at each of these characteristics and determine what is missing in our silvicultural treatment. So a lot of the stuff I've talked about, we will do it together in the next few days. But before that, Klaus, you come. You didn't see my talk, I think. Eh? You saw some of it before, but you didn't really know what I was talking about. So we'll see how resilient he is and how he can adapt. Any burning questions, Emily? Did you understand? Something?
See, Emily, now you know why I said let's go to the park and come back later.
About